All right, welcome to Astrological Term Essay Questions, Section A, Historical Foundations. So we have 3 different questions to go off of here. I'm going to start with the first one. Astrology is the original symbolic science from which both astronomy and psychology diverged. Critically evaluate this statement with reference to the intellectual history of the Renaissance, focusing on the works of figures such as Marsilio Ficino, Johannes Kepler, and Robert Fludd. Okay. The primordial unity. Astrology and the divergence of sciences in the Renaissance. The assertion that astrology constitutes the original symbolic science from which astronomy and psychology diverge presents a compelling, if somewhat romanticized, framework for understanding the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. To evaluate this claim critically is to navigate the complex pre-disciplinary landscape of the 15th to 17th centuries, where what we now classify as science, philosophy, magic, and theology were inextricably intertwined. While it is anachronistic to project modern disciplinary boundaries onto this period, the statement holds a significant kernel of truth. Through an examination of the works of Marsilio Ficino, Johannes Kepler, and Robert Fludd, this essay will argue that a holistic, astrologically informed worldview did provide a foundational paradigm. However, the subsequent divergence was not a clean schism but a protracted process of differentiation, driven by a shifting epistemology from qualitative symbolism to quantitative mechanics, a process that ultimately marginalized the core principles of the very tradition from which it sprang. The Florentine Platonist Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, stands as a quintessential exemplar of the symbolic science described in the question. For Ficino, astrology was not a deterministic practice of prediction, but a profound psychological and spiritual technology. In his seminal work, De Vita Triplici, 1489, Ficino articulated a universe alive with meaning, connected by a web of occult sympathies governed by the Neoplatonic principle of as above, so below. The planets were not merely physical bodies, but repositories of divine qualities, or spiritus mundi, which could be channeled to influence the human spiritus, the subtle link between soul and body. His astrological magic was, in essence, a form of psychotherapy avant la lettre. By consciously aligning one's life with beneficial planetary influences, using Jovian or venereal talismans to counteract Saturnine melancholy, the individual could heal the soul and achieve a state of balance. Here, the unity of the original paradigm is clear. Ficino's astrology was simultaneously a cosmology understanding the world, a psychology healing the soul, and a proto-astronomy studying the celestial bodies that mediated these influences. There was no divergence because the study of the heavens was intrinsically linked to the study of the inner world. The stars were symbols, and their power was both real and hermeneutic. Ficino's work thus perfectly embodies the original symbolic science, a unified field of study from which a more introspective qualitative psychology could later be said to have diverged. The case of Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, illustrates the beginning of the painful and ambiguous process of divergence. Kepler was a figure straddling two worlds, the hermetic, symbolic universe of Ficino and the emerging mechanistic universe of Galileo. He was a committed astrologer who cast horoscopes for patrons and defended the practice, yet he was also the formidable mathematician who discovered the laws of planetary motion. Kepler sought to purge astrology of what he saw as superstitious dross, the zodiacal signs, the houses, the complex rulerships, while preserving what he believed was its core physical reality. He replaced the traditional symbolic framework with a physical astrological theory, proposing that planetary aspects, like conjunctions and oppositions, work through a system of geometrical rays and light intensity that physically affected the Earth's anima motrix, world soul, and by extension, the human soul and weather. In Kepler, we witnessed the divorce of astronomy from astrology in its traditional form. His astronomy became a mathematical physics concerned with calculating orbital ellipses. His astrology became a subset of a physical causal theory. The rich symbolism of the Ficinian world was flattened into a mechanical model. The divergence is not yet complete for Kepler. The connection was still real, but the epistemological ground had shifted. The question was no longer what does this symbol mean, but what physical force does this geometry exert? The path towards a purely materialist astronomy was now open, while the psychological dimension still present in its concept of the world soul was becoming increasingly untenable within the new scientific ethos. Robert Fludd, 1574 to 1637, represents the reactive defense of the original undifferentiated paradigm against the new philosophy of Kepler and his contemporaries. Fludd's encyclopedic works, such as the Utrusiac Cosmi Historia, 1617 to 1621, present a universe that is fundamentally allegorical and symbolic. For Fludd, to study the macrocosm was to read the book of God's creation, a book written in symbols, not equations. His famous illustrations depict the cosmos as a divine monochord, perfectly tuned, integrating music, geometry, and cosmology into a unified whole. He engaged in a bitter pamphlet war with Kepler, whom he accused of being a mere mathematician who concerned himself with the quantitative shadow of reality while ignoring the qualitative light of divine truth that gave it meaning. In Fludd, we see the original symbolic science in its pure, uncompromised form, but also in its death throes. He is a living fossil of the Ficenian worldview, for whom any divergence between the study of the heavens and the study of the soul was unthinkable and heretical. His work is a testament to the paradigm that was being lost. The fact that history remembers Kepler as a founding father of modern science and Fludd as an esoteric curiosity is itself evidence of the success of the divergence. Fludd's psychology remained embedded within his cosmology. It did not diverge because it had not yet been conceived of as a separate field of inquiry. It was the emerging mechanistic worldview that would eventually create the conceptual space for a secular psychology to develop independently of cosmological speculation. In conclusion, the statement that astrology was the original symbolic science from which astronomy and psychology diverged is a powerful heuristic, though it simplifies a more complex historical reality. The Renaissance worldview, exemplified by Ficino, was indeed a unified one in which celestial study was inherently symbolic and psychologically potent. Kepler represents the pivotal moment of fracture where the astronomical and astrological began to be pried apart by a new commitment to mathematical physics and mechanical causation, even as he tried to hold them together. Fludd, meanwhile, stands as the eloquent defender of the old unity, his defeat marking the triumph of the divergent path. Therefore, the divergence was not so much a clean split as a fundamental transformation in the conception of knowledge itself. The symbolic science of the Renaissance was based on correspondence, quality, and meaning. The new sciences of astronomy and later psychology were founded on causality, quantity, and mechanism. The original paradigm did not so much give birth to its successors as it was dismantled by them. The psychological insights of a Ficino were discarded, along with his cosmology, only to be rediscovered centuries later by Jung, who himself would look back to this very tradition. Thus, while the statement captures an essential truth about the primordial role of astrology, it is in the fraught, contested work of figures like Kepler that we see the birth pangs of our modern, fragmented understanding of the cosmos and the human mind. All right, now let's move on to question 2. To what extent did the Enlightenment project of the 17th and 18th centuries, with its emphasis on mechanistic materialism, fundamentally misrepresent the philosophical and hermeneutic basis of traditional astrology? Your answer should consider the arguments of both proponents and detractors. Okay. A universe stripped of soul, the Enlightenment's misreading of the astrological tradition. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, with its triumphant march towards mechanism, quantification, and empirical skepticism, did not merely challenge the practice of astrology, it enacted a profound epistemological shift that rendered the very philosophical foundations of the tradition unintelligible to the new intellectual orthodoxy. To claim that the Enlightenment misrepresented traditional astrology is to suggest a failure of interpretation, and this is precisely the core of the argument. The project of thinkers like Descartes, Newton, and the French philosophies fundamentally misconstrued the nature of traditional astrological thought by judging a qualitative, symbolic, and hermeneutic system through a lens of quantitative mechanistic, and materialist criteria. While the detractors of astrology from this period to the present rightly identified fatalistic superstition and empirical failings in its popular practice, their critique often missed the mark by failing to engage with the sophisticated philosophical worldview that underpinned the tradition at its height. The philosophical basis of traditional astrology, particularly as refined in the Renaissance Neoplatonism of figures like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, was rooted in a universe alive with meaning and connection. The central principle was not mechanical causation, but symbolic correspondence encapsulated in the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below. This was a participatory cosmos where the celestial bodies, the above, were not understood as mere lumps of matter exerting gravitational or radiative force, but as visible signs of intelligible principles, as archetypes whose qualities were mirrored in the terrestrial and human realms, the below. The mode of understanding required was not calculation alone, but interpretation or hermeneutics. Reading a horoscope was akin to exegeting a sacred text. It was an act of discerning meaning and pattern within a complex web of symbols, not predicting specific events like an astronomical machine. The celestial configuration was a symbolic language describing the qualitative tone of a time, the potentialities of a life, or the inner psychological landscape of an individual. The Enlightenment project, however, inaugurated a radical departure from this worldview. The scientific revolution's great achievement, epitomized by Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, was to replace a world of qualities and purposes with a universe of quantities and laws. Descartes' division of reality into res cogitans, thinking substance, and res extensa, extended substance, effectively banished soul, meaning, and final causes from the physical world. The cosmos became a vast, impersonal clockwork governed by immutable mathematical laws. This mechanistic materialism was the new orthodoxy, and it became the yardstick by which all knowledge was measured. It is from this new epistemological vantage point that the Enlightenment's misrepresentation of astrology begins. The proponents of the new philosophy, such as Bernard Le Bovier de Fontenelle, attacked astrology on grounds that were, from their perspective, unassailable. They argued that the physical influences of planets, judged by the inverse square law of gravitation or the diminution of light over distance, were too weak to account for the specific character traits or destinies of individuals. This critique, however, spectacularly misses the point. It attacks a straw man, a crude, physicalist astrology that the best traditional theorists did not uphold. They accused astrology of a faulty physics while remaining blind to its attempt at a meaningful metaphysics. By reducing the rich qualitative language of planetary aspects, trines, squares, oppositions, to mere geometric angles, and by dismissing planetary influences from the Latin influere to flow in as a form of inefficient physics, the Enlightenment detractors judged a symbolic system by a mechanistic standard. They were, in effect, criticizing a poem for its failure to function as a technical manual. This misrepresentation had devastating consequences. The defense of astrology was forced onto enemy territory. Astrologers, increasingly marginalized from the intellectual mainstream, often abandoned the sophisticated hermeneutic model and retreated into a literalistic and deterministic framework that was easier to communicate, but philosophically impoverished. Alternatively, they attempted to find a physical basis for astrology, as Kepler had tentatively begun, searching for a mechanism that would satisfy the new scientific consensus, a search that largely continues to this day without resounding success. The Enlightenment critique, by framing the debate in purely physical and empirical terms, successfully defined the terms of the argument for the next 3 centuries. The public perception of astrology shifted from a complex philosophical art to a simplistic fortune-telling game, a character that its modern detractors, such as the members of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, or CSICOP, happily perpetuate. However, to present the Enlightenment critique as a pure misrepresentation would be one-sided. Its proponents raise valid objections that any serious student of astrology must confront. The charge of fatalism, while often a simplification, forced a necessary reckoning with the ethical implications of astrological practice. If the stars compel, then what becomes of free will? This pressure ultimately contributed to the development of the more psychological and humanistic astrology of the 20th century, as seen in the work of Dane Rudder. Furthermore, the Enlightenment's emphasis on empirical verification, while often applied unfairly, highlighted the profound lack of consistent predictive success and the problem of confirmation bias within astrological practice. The detractors rightly exposed the vast amount of charlatanism and uncritical thinking that had flourished under the umbrella of astrological tradition. Their demand for rigor, even if their criteria were sometimes misplaced, was a legitimate challenge to intellectual complacency. In conclusion, the Enlightenment project did indeed fundamentally misrepresent the philosophical and hermeneutic basis of traditional astrology. It replaced a participatory cosmos of meaning with a mechanical universe of matter, and then judged the former by the standards of the latter. The rich symbolic language of correspondence was flattened into an implausible physical theory, and the art of interpretation was dismissed as superstition for its failure to meet empirical tests designed for a different kind of inquiry. The extent of this misrepresentation was nearly total, and it successfully exiled astrology from the realm of respectable intellectual discourse. Yet, the Enlightenment's detraction was not without value. It acted as a necessary purgative, forcing astrology to confront its own worst tendencies towards literalism, determinism, and unsubstantiated claim. The modern astrological project, if it is to regain intellectual credibility, must therefore walk a difficult path. It must recover the sophisticated hermeneutic basis that the Enlightenment misrepresented and discarded, while simultaneously developing a rigorous language and methodology that can address the legitimate demands for consistency and evidence, not by capitulating to a narrow mechanistic materialism, but by articulating a coherent post-mechanistic paradigm that can once again find a place for soul, symbol, and meaning in a comprehensible universe. All right, and finally, question 3. Assess the role and influence of theosophy, particularly through the work of Alan Leo, in shaping the popular practice and philosophical underpinnings of modern Western astrology in the early 20th century. Was this a dumbing down or a necessary democratization? The Theosophical Crucible, Alan Leo and the Forging of Modern Astrology. The emergence of the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, with its syncretic blend of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and a progressive evolutionary worldview, provided a vital lifeline to an astrological tradition languishing in the intellectual backwaters of a scientific and materialist age. At the forefront of this revival was William Frederick Allen, who, under the nom de plume Alan Leo, became the single most influential figure in shaping the popular practice and philosophical underpinnings of modern Western astrology. To assess his work is to confront a central tension in the history of our discipline. Did Leo, empowered by theosophy, enact a profound and necessary democratization of astrological knowledge, or did he oversee a catastrophic dumbing down that severed the art from its technical and philosophical depths? A critical examination suggests that these two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Rather, Leo's project was one of strategic simplification and philosophical reorientation that saved astrology from obscurity at the cost of much of its traditional rigor. Prior to the theosophical intervention, astrology in the Victorian era was a fractured and diminished practice. It persisted largely through the vulgar tradition of almanacs and newspaper predictions, or in the complex deterministic horary and electional techniques preserved by a handful of dedicated but isolated practitioners. It lacked a coherent philosophical framework that could withstand the scorn of the modern scientific establishment or appeal to the burgeoning spiritual seeking of the fin de siècle. The Theosophical Society under Helena Blavatsky provided precisely this framework. Its doctrines of karma, reincarnation, and spiritual evolution offered a new, compelling rationale for astrology. The horoscope was no longer a map of fixed fate, but a chart of the soul, indicating the karmic lessons the individual had incarnated to learn and the latent spiritual potentials awaiting development. This was a radical shift from a deterministic model to a psychological and spiritual one. Alan Leo, a charismatic theosophist, grasped the immense potential of this new paradigm and built a veritable astrological industry upon it. His genius was not that of an original philosopher, but of a brilliant popularizer and systematizer. He effectively created the template for what we now recognize as modern sun sign astrology. Through his publishing house, his magazine Modern Astrology, and his correspondent courses, Leo repackaged astrology for the masses. He shifted the primary focus from the complex and time-sensitive task of chart calculation and precise prediction to the more accessible art of character analysis based on the planetary positions by sign and house. This is the crux of the dumbing down accusation. Leo's system, which emphasized broad psychological types and spiritual potentials, deliberately marginalized the traditional techniques that demanded immense skill and nuance. The precise timing methods of primary directions or the intricate symbolism of the fixed stars were sidelined in favor of a more generalized talk therapeutic approach. His famous dictum to character is fate, while a powerful rhetorical tool for combating fatalism, effectively absolved the astrologer from the difficult responsibility of predicting specific events. Critics then and now argue that he reduced a profound symbolic science to a form of spiritualized parlor game, creating a generation of astrologers who could talk convincingly about the soul, but could not pinpoint a significant life event with any precision. The commercial success of his 12 types based on the sun signs laid the groundwork for the simplistic newspaper columns that many modern critics quite rightly hold in contempt. However, to dismiss Leo's work as more dilution is to profoundly misread the historical moment and the strategic necessity of his actions. The charge of dumbing down often carries a whiff of intellectual elitism, a nostalgia for a time when astrological knowledge was the preserve of a privileged few. Leo's democratization was nothing short of revolutionary. By simplifying the language and emphasizing self-improvement and spiritual growth, he made astrology relevant and accessible to a middle class, often female, audience seeking meaning beyond the confines of established religion. He did not simply remove complexity, he replaced one set of priorities, prediction, with another, characterology, and spiritual purpose. In doing so, he ensured the survival of the astrological tradition. Without the popular revival he spearheaded, it is entirely plausible that the deeper, more technical strands of astrology would have faded into complete obscurity, studied only by antiquarians rather than living practitioners. Furthermore, to claim that Leo entirely abandoned philosophy for simplicity is incorrect. He replaced the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic metaphysics underlying traditional astrology with a new theosophical philosophy. The horoscope became a map for spiritual evolution across lifetimes. A difficult Saturn placement was not merely a malefic portent of loss, but a karmic lesson in discipline and structure from a past life. This provided a profound and ethically satisfying answer to the problem of suffering and bad horoscopes that deterministic astrology had always struggled with. In this sense, Leo did not dumb down the philosophy, he updated it for a new post-Darwinian, spiritually seeking audience. He made astrology modern. In final analysis, the question of whether Alan Leo's work was a dumbing down or a necessary democratization is a false dichotomy. It was both simultaneously. It was a strategic trade-off. The immense benefit of his theosophy-inspired popularization was the salvation and propagation of astrology as a living tradition, refounded on a modern, psychological, and spiritual basis that continues to dominate its practice today. It empowered individuals to see their lives in a cosmic context and fostered a vast popular interest without which the contemporary revival of more traditional techniques would be impossible. The cost, however, was a significant loss of technical depth and predictive power. Leo's legacy is the schism we still see between the popular sun sign astrology of the masses and the more rigorous reclaiming work of astrological scholars. Perhaps the most balanced view is to see Leo not as the culmination of the astrological tradition, but as its necessary conduit through the arid landscape of modernity. He kept the flame alive, even if he had to dim it somewhat to prevent it from being extinguished altogether. The task for astrologers today is to reunite the democratic appeal and spiritual depth he championed with the technical rigor and symbolic richness of the tradition he left behind.